What are the accolades that make for a great film? That's a fundamental question, really, for this video. What are the attributes, the accolades that make a film what it is in terms of public perception, in terms of critical reception? Um, Now, before I get into this, just a few disclaimers, caveats. I am completely biased. I don't come into this pretending to be neutral. I am going to be pitching for Titanic as I do believe it is the greatest film ever made. Um, but I'm not going to say it's the greatest because it's the greatest. I'm going to argue as to why I believe that is the case. Um, and the other caveats are, I guess, I'm not a film student, so I'm not thinking so much in terms of very in-depth technical side the technical side of things. I find that film students in particular tend to be quite opinionated towards particularly older films and particularly films that are pioneering in the work. I recognize that. I recognize the importance of that. One interesting thing about Titanic is it's an occasion where I actually agree with the critics. Roger Ebert praised Titanic. The critics generally, with one or two exceptions, critically acclaimed this film. Now, some of films I really appreciate either got negative reviews or didn't get a good review. With Titanic, there are very few negative reviews. Although I know that there was some nominations in 1998 where it incredibly got, I don't think it was a Golden Raspberry, it was something else for worst performances or something. But almost no one takes that seriously. And it's almost like, look at it this way, famous people who get satirized, for example, it's almost a mark of respect, even if it's not a particularly flattering portrayal, because it shows that they're famous enough to be portrayed. By the same token, Titanic is so famous and so influential that it has been parodied many times. This is a film that, over 2 decades on, still spawns, rigorous debate over who could have done what. For example, the famous debate over the door. Could Rose have shared it with Jack? Actually, people conveniently forget, when they do all these little diagrams, they conveniently forget that Jack did try to get on it and it almost toppled over if you watch the film again. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the film because it's such a well-known film that if you're watching this, you probably know what the film's about. But just in case you haven't, this is a very brief version. It's a semi-fictionalized account of the famous Titanic voyage and disaster of April 1912, and it revolves around two main characters: a young first-class lady, Rose de Whittaker, and a young steerage stowaway, Jack Dawson, who fall in love and basically star-crossed lovers. But there is so many more dimensions than that. And when you combine a strong love story with an epic film, that makes for a very powerful picture. If we look at other examples, Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor didn't get anywhere near the critical acclaim of Titanic. It's overall not as good a film, but I believe it was underrated. And again, you had a love story there amidst a famous historical incident. Um, and Pompeii, again, in my view, underrated. You had the love story between Milo and Cassia, if you're familiar with that film. But in my view, nothing comes close to Titanic, and I'm going to lay out the reasons why. So let me just start by looking at some other films that are deemed to be the greatest that have been called that. And I'll have a brief look at why they might be so and my response to that. By the way, I have seen thousands of films in my life. I have about 1,000 DVDs, and everything I'm talking about here I have seen. So it's not like I'm just coming in from reputation. I've said before, I feel that film is very much subjective, and I really don't put a great deal of weight on what critics say because whilst I agree with critics on Titanic, I've seen critics. talk in very negative terms about films that I respect, so that's why I don't give them much weight. Although I understand why it's there because, all these things are taken into consideration when accolades are made. It goes without saying, though, Titanic was a huge film at the time. It was the most expensive film ever made up to that point, $200 million to make. Um, and it won, I think it tied with Ben-Hur for the most awards at an Oscars ceremony. Um, and that's saying something. And I strongly believe that Titanic has stood the test of time. Which brings me to Gone with the Wind. Now, I recently made a video about Gone with the Wind. I recently watched Gone with the Wind. Unquestionably an epic film and an iconic film. I mean, the characters of Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara are very iconic roles. And it is very hard to beat that opening of Gone with the Wind. I think it even rivals Titanic there. The big sweeping letters, that is incredible. Good soundtrack, memorable film, one of the first uses of Technicolor. The only thing with Gone with the Wind is I do believe it is dated somewhat. I don't mean that you can't sit down and get engaged with it. It's not a boring film. However, some of the themes and some of the portrayals are, let's be honest, dated. Um, Schindler's List. Now, Schindler's List has sometimes been called one of the greatest films ever made. It doesn't always get to the top spot, but it's often in that conversation, and you can see why. Schindler's List is a profoundly moving film, and I think, as much as I like Tom Hanks as an actor, I think best actor that year probably should have went to Liam Neeson, 1993. Schindler's List is such a moving film. The only thing with Schindler's List is it is so harrowing, so sad, so moving that maybe it's not accessible to everyone. Maybe it's just too sad. And it's obviously dealing with the subject matter, the Holocaust. It was always going to be a heavy film. But the thing with Schindler's List is I don't know, it's very, very powerful at what it does. It conveys one of the biggest crimes in human history, and it portrays the story of this man who was a flawed human being, and yet he redeems himself. So it's easy to see why Schindler's List is so acclaimed. The only reason I wouldn't put Schindler's List at the top is simply because it can be summed up as a harrowing film and maybe a film of redemption and human spirit. But I don't know if it's accessible in other areas. And I think for a lot of people, it's just too harrowing. But that doesn't take away from it being a great film. Citizen Kane, now. Citizen Kane I watched recently for the first time, and I've always heard it being mentioned among the greatest films ever made. I have to be totally honest, I was a little disappointed. Now, hear me out. Um, I thought it was a good movie. I'd even be willing to say it's a great film. And I fully appreciate because this is what film students would retort. Oh, but look at how it pioneered. It pioneered a lot of cinema techniques, and it did. And there's memorable lines, strong performance by Orson Welles. It's a powerful film, but it just did not move me in the same way that any of the other three that I mentioned did. Maybe I need to watch it again. When I first watched Casablanca, I felt the same way. I thought, what's the big fuss over this? I watched it again and I was a bit more impressed. Then a third time, I thought, well, actually, I do see where, it's memorable lines, it's great acting, there's iconic scenes. So sometimes I think part of it's to do with when you watch a film. I'm 35 and I watched Citizen Kane for the first time. The others I've all known about for years, so that may be something to do with it. So those are some films that are often mentioned in that conversation. Star Wars is sometimes there. I appreciate the creativity of Star Wars, but to me, a fictional film, space opera, it's never going to have the emotional impact of something that really happened. It just won't. Period films move me so profoundly because they're about the human story, because they're about things that really happened. Okay, Jack and Rose may be fictional characters, but it isn't too far a stretch to imagine that there are people in history who were somewhat like them. It really isn't too far a stretch to believe that. Maybe not in love, maybe not in that sort of relationship, but in themselves, that sort of character. There may well have been young first class ladies who did feel entrapped. There may well have been many young steerage men who wanted to, you know, broaden their horizons. So it's really not that big a push. Okay, the story is obviously heavily romanticized. But I'll get into that actually. Um, Multi-dimensional characters. Now I'm talking about Titanic and why I believe it goes above those other films. Um, I think in a strong film you need memorable characters. Now the thing about Titanic, we have our heroine Rose the Whiplacater, we have our villain Cal, but 20 years on, people actually debate these things, regardless of what James Cameron's vision was. The very fact that there are debates around it shows that this is a multi-dimensional look at the characters. For example, we look at the film entirely through Rose's perspective. We haven't heard Cal's point of view. Now, you might think that's just silly fan trivia, but to me, that sort of points to, well, actually, you can look at these characters in different ways. Um, Jack was essentially a petty criminal in some ways. There's a lot of ways to look at this, and it's it's that aspect I think that you can't just dismiss them offhandedly. Now, I'm a straight guy. You might think I would be dismissive of the Jack Rose story in Titanic, and I do think there are two Titanics. I think there are a lot of people, like my father, for example, would approach the film. He's not really interested in the Jack Rose story. I suspect most people, particularly the Chinese audience, was huge interest in the Titanic in the film when it was re-released in 2012, particularly in China. And I remember showing the poster to my students and they all immediately knew Jack and Rose. They knew much more about Jack and Rose than they did about the history of the Titanic. But this is a love story that I think really did resonate. Not just because of the star-crossed lovers aspect, but because they are multi-dimensional characters, and you can actually see in the secondary characters their perspective. So, for example, Rose's mother, there's one point we almost feel sorry for her. Although she's a snob, although she is in many ways all the worst of that class, there's one point where she sort of breaks down and just says, "You want to see all our things go to ruin." And, it's a film that gets you really thinking about the lives of these people, in my opinion. Um, in one of the deleted scenes, there's even a secondary love story with Fabrizio and the Swedish girl that he's with. So I don't think these are forgettable characters. I think they're iconic characters. Um, Epic history. The Titanic, of course, was a real event. It still ranks as one of the worst maritime disasters in history. It's not actually the worst. There have been deadlier maritime incidents, such as the MV Jula off the coast of Senegal in 2002. More people actually died. But with the Titanic, not only was it a major disaster, 1,500 deaths, but it was so symbolic of an era. It was, in a sense, the end of the Gilded Age. It was symbolic of the British Empire. It was symbolic of the arrogance of man. It was symbolic of the aspirations of mankind. Um, and yet, it kind of, in a sense, symbolized what the 20th century would be. Such hopes, such aspirations, modernity. The Titanic had electricity, had the new wireless system. And yet, this disaster was all those dreams shattered. What happened 2 years after the events, World War One broke out. So I remember seeing a documentary on UTV, also television, Titanic made in Belfast, and they spoke about how um, that really resonated to what the 20th century would become. And I'll just briefly say a very big part of this film is personal for me. I've always been interested in the Titanic. Growing up in Belfast, it's almost impossible not to be. The ship was, of course, built there. I was born on the 1st of September 1985, which was the very day it was rediscovered at the bottom of the Atlantic by Robert Ballard's team, um, which I think is quite something. My great great grandfather helped build the ship as a shipyard worker at Harland and Wolff. And at one point, we believe that Thomas Andrews, the architect, the man who says, "Sorry, I didn't build you a stronger ship, young Rose," um, he lived on the street that my grandparents lived on. They had a bed and breakfast in that part of Belfast, and at one point we thought it was the actual house. Unfortunately, it wasn't. But so for me, the film would be impressive in and of itself, but those personal connections just make it all the more powerful. The soundtrack, now, this is an extremely important aspect. I think a powerful film must have a moving soundtrack. You can have great cinematography, good acting, but if it's a forgettable soundtrack, it doesn't necessarily mean the film's forgettable, but I think it helps. You know, film scores are rightly recognized more and more. That's why geniuses like John Williams and Jack Horner, um, James Horner, excuse me, are appreciated because the Ennio Morricone is another one. And the thing about Titanic, we're not just talking about one or two songs. In fact, that's what I would say was the thing with some other epic films. Okay, Gone with the Wind had a great soundtrack, but did Citizen Kane? Certainly, I can't remember it. I mean, people say, "Oh, that's a soundtrack from Citizen Kane." No, they don't immediately go to it. Star Wars, okay. Schindler's List, okay. Casablanca, I can't think. I guess it did. But with Titanic, you don't just have one. It's not just My Heart Will Go On, which was, of course, great vocals by Celine Dion, but it's Ocean of Memories, Never an Absolution. These are all powerful, powerful, profoundly moving songs. I mean, the scene where Rose is lying on the door and she's exhausted and she's looking up at the stars. It's so beautiful, so haunting. Um, Titanic wouldn't have been Titanic without the soundtrack, and it's just so well timed. I mean, that was. I hope it got Oscars for that. I hope it was recognized. I don't know if it did or not, but um, then we get into attention to detail. Now, Titanic is not without mistakes. There are some one or two historic errors, and there were controversial scenes such as the depiction of Second Officer Murdoch, excuse me, First Officer Murdoch taking his own life. That was controversial, and 20th Century Fox actually had to go to Dalbeatty and apologise to his family. I think that was probably a mistake. I don't think Cameron should have used an actual historic character in that way. And then there's other characters like Bruce Ismay, who has been maligned throughout history. I made another video specifically on that, and Cameron's film is no exception. Um, Talk of characters, just quickly on my last point about characters. Um, other films have had something of a love story. Um, for example, the 1996 film, they've had background stories. There was a whole thing there with a stowaway who kind of gets into bad company with Tim Curry. That's the version with Catherine Zeta-Jones. It's an okay film version. The A Night to Remember, which was a great film in its own right, had one or two background stories, but for the most part, the films have tended to focus on the disaster. With Titanic, Cameron really, really knew how to get a love story and an epic film and merge them together in a very powerful way. A few other films have done that. You get it to some extent in Pearl Harbor, and you get it in a few other films, but the way Titanic merged the two was just so powerful. I mean, for those who say, oh, it's just the whole Jack and Rose love story, yes, that's a big part of it, a very big part of it, but a large part of the film is about the ship. And the fact there are strong supporting roles is very important. I could understand people getting bored of Titanic if it was just about Jack and Rose, but it really isn't. Um, that's another strength of this film. It doesn't rely on the lead characters, although they're extremely important. The supporting characters are strong supporting characters. By attention to detail, it's little things like the exact design of the grand staircase, the fact that on the night, for example, binoculars did in fact go missing. That was historically archived. And whilst there are one or two historic mistakes or errors, or let's say artistic license, for the most part, James Cameron done his homework, and so did the other makers. They really did do their homework. Just the fact that, even at the start, the attention to detail on the submersible, just I think the attention to detail in this film, the costume designs, um, there were actually gates in this is a matter of some debate. There was gates at steerage, and they were actually meant to be locked during the voyage, except in emergencies. Now, what probably happened on the night was the stewards got confused as to what their orders were, so some doors were open, some were closed. So that's relatively realistic. Although they probably weren't necessarily like kept in at gunpoint. That may be artistic license. But in many other ways, there's a lot of details about the scale of the ship, about I mean, whatever else you can say about this film, no one can fault the work James Cameron and his colleagues put into this. Building, building a ship 3/4 to scale. Now, the cinematography in this, we almost take it for granted now because of CGI is so used today. In the 1990s, it was still relatively new. It had been used before. I guess CGI could be dated back to probably the late 80s. Jurassic Park was a big pioneer, but Titanic really did utilize it in a profound way but not over the top. They also utilize acting, they also utilize the set, and it's an amalgamation of all those things that worked profoundly well. Some films overuse CGI, other films underuse it. Titanic, I think, got the balance just right. Even the lifeboat numbers, um, the way that people died, the fact that as the ship's sinking, you have furniture falling down. I don't think any of the other Titanic films show details like that. Even the way the ship sank. Now, it may be that it wasn't quite at a 90-degree angle, more at a 30-degree angle. Cameron himself has said if he was making Titanic today, he may re-explore some of that. What I respect about James Cameron is this guy is not just a filmmaker. He is an academic, he really does know his stuff. He's been to the Titanic. He is an oceanographer. He really is a man of multiple talents. Um, so all those things is why I believe this film will be timeless. The fact that so many things have spun out of Titanic, the fact people are still robustly debating it. You can go to any Titanic video, people make references to it. I am not sure that Citizen Kane or Casablanca or other films have quite the same level of influence. Now, I'm not saying that they don't have influence. They are famous films in their own right, but I think Titanic is unsurpassed. And for me, film I find a lot of film students get a little bit snobby about this almost, where they really look at the technical side of things and say, "Oh, but this was pioneering," and they almost dismiss popular appeal. Now, I'm sorry, Citizen Kane just doesn't have the same public resonance as Titanic does. I think it probably was a big film at the time, but 80 years on, we're talking about Citizen Kane. Okay, it was a great film, but are we seeing loads of parodies? Are we seeing extensive debates online? I'm not sure that we are. I feel that Titanic, 50 years from now, will still have that impact. And I tell you something, the film that surpasses Titanic will be an absolute masterpiece. Um, but I think all those ingredients, taking a real historic disaster, all those things, um, it moves me every time. I have no problem admitting Titanic is pretty much guaranteed to get me emotional. And yes, the Jack Rose love story is a big part of it, but the history as well. The fact this was a liner that went down, the way it shows the band playing to the end, the Irish mother reading the Irish legend to her children, the Strausses in their bed. Just there's so many tenets of this film, so many aspects of this film that are so memorable and so enduring. And for all those reasons, I believe that Titanic is the greatest film ever made. Thanks for watching.